everyone. This Voice is Vital. I know it's a bit of a tongue twister, but basically what we're going to be doing is talking about the extreme weather events that we're experiencing across the world and how those are affecting the livelihoods of people in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly farming communities. And if it sounds wildly complicated, don't worry. I have just the person to break it down for you. Her name is Nasike. She's a food campaigner at Greenpeace Africa, and she's also an agroecologist. So she's really the expert here. And I'm Edith Kimani. I'm a journalist at Deutsche Welle. This is Germany's international broadcaster, but I'm very passionate about Africa and climate change. So those two worlds are colliding beautifully here. So let's get to it. So Nasike, I said that you're the expert. So let's begin with what Greenpeace have just done. Recently published this report that's really talking about what we've just intimated, the relationship between these extreme weather patterns and climate change. Can you talk us through some of the highlights of this report?
Thank you so much, Edith, for having me today. Climate change comes with something known as extreme weather events. When you talk of extreme weather events, we're looking at cyclones, we're looking at floods, we're looking at droughts that have been affecting the African region. We're looking at the recent locust invasion that took place in Kenya. People lost their livelihoods. So the report that was launched by Greenpeace Africa and the Greenpeace Science Unit, known as the Weathering the Storm, this report looks at the connect between these extreme weather events and climate change. And it doesn't just stop there. It also goes to show that the annual temperatures in Africa are going to rise. So when these temperatures rise, then we're going to have several effects that are going to arise from this. We're talking about drought, we're talking about floods, we're talking about locust invasions, we're looking at the cyclones. Just recently we saw Somalia has been hit by Cyclone Gati. There's also Cyclone Idai that just happened recently in Africa. So those are some of the things that this report looks at, and what are the impacts of these extreme weather events on the local communities, particularly in the African context.
So obviously, when you're discussing these issues, it sounds like, really big and complicated themes, but how are they affecting day-to-day people?
When we talk about these extreme weather events, particularly floods, and I'll be very specific, I'd like to speak of the Kenyan farmers, for I have worked with them for a number of years. This year was actually the hardest for them. So a lot of farmers lost their livelihoods. And particularly, I met one farmer, her name was Mwende from Kitui County. Mwende depends on farming. It is her livelihood. It is her everything. For her kids to go to school, she has to grow food. For her to have food in her house, she has to farm. So when the locusts attacked her farm, I think in February, she was certain that her kids will not go to school. She was certain that her household will not have food. And it's just not Mwende alone. I speak of farmers from Budalangi, where I come from, who are affected by floods. They lost their livelihoods. They moved from their homes to camps. They were depending on donations, people bringing in food. They were used to taking care of themselves. They had food for themselves. They were growing food to feed themselves. But then now they were taken to camps because their homes were flooded. So these extreme weather events are impacting local communities more and more. We're seeing stories of communities that are unable to sustain themselves because of the impacts of climate change.
That's absolutely true. And it's interesting you should mention flooding, because I've actually just come from Rift Valley, where I was covering this exact same thing. You know, the water levels of the rivers and the lakes there are rising to a level that has been not seen before. And so in doing this research, I spoke to someone who said that the El Nino rains of 1998, the same rainfall we experienced then was equivalent to what was experienced in that region in 2018. I mean, if you take a moment to really think about that, that's a lot of rainfall in 1 year. And then sustained with 2019 rainfall, which has not stopped in that area. What does that do to a people? They used to be pastoralists. We know the people from Rift Valley are very good with their cattle. And then they decided they were going to go into farming because there was a drought in that area. And now they're having to be fishermen. I mean, think about it. These are people who have done one thing for millennia, and it's being changed radically, literally overnight, because a year is nothing compared to the hundreds of years that these people have been doing what they're doing. And I'm curious to know from you, if these are stories that are expansive across the region, is it just unique to Kenya? And what to do about it, because it always feels like we're so helpless.
I think these stories are not only unique to Kenya. I've spoken to other African climate activists, and they share the same sentiments that we do. You experienced it firsthand. They also experienced it firsthand. So we're looking at climate activists such as Hindu from Chad, who's been speaking about flooding in Chad. This is not only specific to Chad, it's also happening in Kenya. And these are things that we are experiencing, but we are contributing the least to. When we talk about what causes climate change, we have anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic causes of climate change. But
Nasike, please, anthropo who? Please break it down for us.
well, climate change can be caused by natural causes or unnatural causes. So unnatural causes, these are human causes. Fossil fuel emissions. You heard of the Lamu coal plant and why everyone was fighting the Lamu coal plant. The reason it was being fought, it was because of the emissions that it was going to cause. So Africa has contributed the least to the greenhouse gas emissions that are responsible for causing climate change. But Africa is suffering the most. We're talking about flooding, we're talking about locust invasions, we're talking about cyclones and droughts. I've seen a lot of communities, a lot of farming communities are putting into place practices that are helping them adapt to the impacts of this climate change, the impacts of these extreme weather events.
I want us to get to adaptation of those solutions, but first let's talk about something that's really close to all of us: food. Farmlands go under, when livestock are now threatened by animals because of human wildlife encroachment. What has that done economically, especially in urban areas? Have the food prices gone up? What have the locusts meant for a food basket?
Well, the food prices have gone up, particularly this year. There came COVID and there was the locust invasion. We Nairobians do not grow food. The food you and I consume in Nairobi comes from out of Nairobi. The villages, Makueni, Machakos, Nyahururu, Nyandarua, all those areas. So you can imagine there's a locust invasion in Ukambani. Ukambani gives us mangoes. They give us pulses, beans, dengu, name it. When the locust invasions hit, they were unable to produce what they normally produce. So they were not selling anything to the market. Most of the farmers said, we are keeping this for our families. So when COVID hit, Nairobi was under lockdown. Food could not get into Nairobi. What did that mean? That the little food that was in Nairobi was going to be sold at a very high price. So the food prices skyrocketed. So that means that if you cannot afford the prices, then you're going hungry. And what does that equate to? Food insecurity. People lost their jobs. Remember, the food prices are high, people have lost their jobs. People cannot afford the food that is being sold in the market. That also equates to food insecurity because they have no financial capacity to buy the food, yet the food is there. But some of them, there's the food, but they have no money.
Yeah, I really like how you're tying everything together, because we're talking about extreme weather patterns, the climate crisis, and how farmers are affected. But now we're even seeing how we are affected. So going back to adaptation of solutions from farmers, what are some of the sustainable things we can do to finally put an end to this? Is that even possible?
I think it is possible, Edith. The reason I say it is possible, I have seen it. I have experienced it with the farmers that I work with. And these farmers, I call them heroes. They are our local heroes. They have been putting in place practices such as ecological farming. And to the layman who doesn't understand what ecological farming is, this is basically you are growing food using traditional knowledge, you combine it with scientific knowledge to protect the environment and to make sure that you have enough food to feed yourself, your family, your friends, and even sell some. So some of the ecological farming practices that these farmers have been putting in place, like one of them is the use of indigenous seeds. They discover that the indigenous seeds are doing well during this period of drought or when the climatic patterns are varying. So they discover that these seeds do not actually die compared to the hybrid seeds, and they actually do well throughout the planting season. So these farmers are moving back to the indigenous seeds. You see them storing the seeds, sharing the seeds amongst each other. Aside from that, they're also using other practices. We're talking about drought being an impact of climate change. There's minimal water. If there's little water in the soil, crops cannot grow. So some of these farmers are actually coming out with practices such as zai pits that help to maintain soil moisture, like enough water in the soil to ensure that crops grow despite the drought season. So some of these are things that the local communities can do, and they're actually doing to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And that's why I say these people are my heroes. They're being affected by this, but they're looking for ways in which they can survive, ways in which they can continue to grow food for us, to grow food for themselves, ways in which they can continue to sustain themselves. And for me, that is resilience of the highest order.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to agree with you on that. And I must admit, this is the same energy I felt when I saw people, like I mentioned earlier, who are adapting in spite of, this insurmountable problem. They're moving on and providing food not just for themselves, but for the country. I wonder, though, if we should be holding our governments responsible. Should we perhaps demand guaranteed minimum returns for farmers? Should we be asking insurance companies to extend their weather-based insurance?
I think the one thing that I really need to see our governments being held accountable for is making sure that they declare one climate emergency, and not just declaring a climate emergency, but setting aside climate change funds to help communities bounce back from the effects of climate change. I've spoken of Mwende initially. Like, if we have farmers like Mwende who've been affected by locust invasions, they cannot grow food. That's their livelihood. That's where they get money to plant for the next season. That means they don't have money if they are affected by floods and locusts. So the government needs to ensure that such kind of people have access to these climate change funds. They are able to bounce back when they're hit by such kind of impacts. The other thing that the government needs to do is to educate farmers. I realize that once you speak to the farmers and create awareness, they are able to know what is happening. And they can even tell you what are some of the things that they are doing, so that as the government is planning, how then do we help communities adapt to this? They're even putting in place the solutions that the local communities are doing, which most of the times is often missing. The government plans at the higher level, the local communities at the bottom. So when the government brings its plans, they don't sit well with what the local communities are doing. And that is something that we need to hold the government accountable for. We need to make sure that our governments are not signing on to projects that are going to increase emissions. I'm so glad that Kenyans stood up and said no to the Lamu coal plant. That was a very good thing for Kenyans to do. We need to hold our governments accountable. We need to make sure that they are doing what is right. 80% of the food we eat in Kenya, Edith, comes from smallholder farmers. So if these farmers stopped producing food, then we as Kenyans are going to be food insecure. That is a guarantee. We are going to be food insecure. So our government needs to realize this and act swiftly to make sure that these farmers are cushioned. We need to push our governments to make the right decisions, to make the right investments. We don't want fossil fuels in Kenya. We don't want that at all. We need to make sure that we are supported to move in the right direction, to make sure that we have food. No Kenyans are dying from food insecurity. No Kenyans are dying from hunger, We have to make sure that our local communities, our pastoralists are not being forced to go and grow food, yet they have been pastoralists all their lives. Where is the insurance to make sure that these pastoralists are cushioned when their livestock dies? Those are the things that we need to make sure that we push our government so hard that they put that in place. Because if they don't do that, then we're all going to die.
Ooh, that's a really grim point to end on, but I like it because it just sort of puts fire under everyone's feet. So let me just do a really sweet conclusion of just what we've just discussed. The big takeaways here. You've just said that Africa is and will be disproportionately affected by this climate crisis, and it's our responsibility to act. How we do that, you have shown us great examples of how farmers are already doing it sustainably, and most importantly, good Jesus, we need to just call on to our governments to do more. And actually, if you're wondering how to do this in a better way, or if you need guidelines on how to do that, Greenpeace has a call to action. And I'm sure that the link will be down below so that if you ever have questions or if you want to know where to begin, sometimes it can be overwhelming. That's a great place to start. So I'm Edith Kimani and Claire Nasike Akelo. You want to say goodbye?
Thank you so much, Edith, for having me. This was such an insightful conversation, and we hope that more Kenyans will be signing the petition, will be joining us in this fight to ask to hold our governments accountable and to protect the local communities from the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, I can hear your phone dinging in the background. It's probably time for you to go. So bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.